Have you ever noticed that the periods of your life when you're the busiest somehow end up being the periods you remember as the happiest? Because I have been thinking about this for the last couple of weeks, actually probably longer than that, and the more I compare different periods of my own life, the less sense it makes to me. I mean, we're constantly taught that what we really need is more free time, right? Finish school, finish university, get rid of all these obligations, finally have a schedule that belongs to you, and then you start living. But I don't know, every time my life gets more free time, it somehow becomes worse, and I genuinely don't understand why. Like, isn't something that started recently. I can trace it all the way back to school. Every September, my calendar would suddenly become packed. I had classes almost every day, homework, music school, and then later university replaced school. YouTube became a huge part of my life. I started working out regularly. Sometimes I had little side jobs, random projects, and somehow the things fit into the same 24 hours. Looking back now, I honestly have no idea how I managed it, because if you ask me today to fit that exact schedule into my week, I'd probably laugh and tell you it's impossible. And yet, it wasn't impossible. Which is funny because now it's summer, university is over for a while, music school is also on pause. Nobody expects anything from me except the things I choose to do myself. I still go to the gym, I still make YouTube videos, I still have things I generally enjoy doing, so it's not like my days are completely empty, but everything suddenly starts stretching for no reason. Editing takes longer, filming takes longer, even cleaning my house somehow becomes a project instead of a chore. I start thinking, well, maybe I'll reorganize this shelf too. And then somehow 3 hours disappear, and honestly, I couldn't even tell you what I accomplished during those 3 hours. And the weirdest part isn't even that. The weirdest part is how different I feel. During the academic year, I usually go to bed thinking, wow, I actually got a lot done today. It doesn't even matter if I was tired. In fact, usually I was tired. But is that a satisfying kind of tired where your brain almost congratulates you before you fall asleep? You feel like your life moved somewhere today. Now I finished the day, I don't even know what happened. I was busy, sort of. But it doesn't feel like it. And honestly, I have caught myself doing something that kind of scares me. My screen time recently, I checked it yesterday because I was curious, averages around 11 hours a day, which sounds insane when I say it out loud. Now, to be fair, I read books on my phone too, so it's not 11 straight hours of social media, but still. During university, there were days when my total screen time barely reached 1 hour. 1 hour. The same person, by the way. Welcome, I'm in Chile. So naturally, I started asking myself whether I've simply become lazier over the summer, because that's the obvious explanation, isn't it? Except I don't think that's true. I don't feel less ambitious. I don't suddenly care less about my goals. If anything, I have more opportunities now because I finally have time to work on them. And somehow that's exactly when everything slows down. I actually realized something yesterday that made me stop for a second. This summer feels strangely familiar, and I think I finally understand why. It almost feels like I am accidentally testing what my life might look like after university, when nobody builds my schedule for me anymore. And honestly, that thought made me much more comfortable than I expected, because maybe this isn't really about summer at all. The more I think about it, the stranger this whole thing becomes, because if the problem really was laziness, then it should have been there all year long, right? I mean, people don't usually become a completely different person just because the calendar says it's June instead of October, and honestly, I don't think I suddenly lost all my discipline overnight. If anything, I have moments that make me think the opposite is true, and that's where I start noticing another pattern that has been following me for years without me ever paying attention to it. I almost never finish things early, which, by the way, I'm not proud of. I wish I were one of those people who complete assignments 2 weeks before the deadline and spend the remaining time peacefully drinking coffee and reading books. But that's just not me. I remember writing one of my university papers while, let's just say I was very aware of how close the deadline was. My stress levels were impressive. And while I was sitting there thinking, why do I always do this to myself? I somehow managed to produce hours of focused work that would have been impossible for me just a few days earlier. And that's not even a rare exception. That's basically how my brain has always worked. There have been so many situations where I postponed something for days, convinced myself it was this huge complicated project and then suddenly finished the entire thing in one evening because I simply didn't have another option anymore. Which is funny because once the deadline disappeared, the same task somehow became bigger again. Not objectively bigger, just mentally bigger. Actually, now that I think about it, this doesn't only happen with university. It happens with YouTube too. During the academic year, I know exactly how much time I have. I know I have lectures, workouts, homework, maybe music school, maybe something else. So when it's finally time to write or film, I just do it. There isn't much negotiation. I don't spend 40 minutes deciding whether this sentence could be slightly better. The work has to fit into the available space, so somehow it does. Summer feels completely different. I open the editing software and instead of thinking, let's finish this before I have to leave, I started thinking, well, technically I have the whole day. And that sentence sounds relaxing. It really does. Until you realize that having the whole day somehow makes every decision more difficult. Should I edit this part now? Or maybe I should rewrite it first? Actually, maybe the introduction isn't good enough. Maybe I should watch a few other videos for inspiration. Maybe I'll make some coffee first because I have plenty of time. And suddenly, I'm making decisions about making decisions instead of actually doing the work. I never consciously decide to waste time. I don't wake up thinking today I'll procrastinate. It feels much more reasonable than that. It feels productive. It feels like I'm improving the project, polishing the details, exploring more options, making sure everything is perfect. And by the time I notice what's happening, how the day is gone, and the actual progress is more than it would be if I'd simply accepted the first decent version and moved on. Which makes me wonder whether deadlines aren't just forcing us to work faster. Maybe they're protecting us from ourselves. Because when the amount of available time becomes infinite, something strange happens to the size of the task itself, and I honestly think that's the only one piece of a much bigger puzzle. You know what I find really interesting about all of this? We spend so much time talking about freedom as if it's automatically a good thing that we almost never stop to ask what freedom actually asks from us in return. Because, I mean, if you think about it, having your entire day completely open sounds amazing when you're overwhelmed. You're sitting in university thinking, I can't wait for summer. You're at work thinking, I just need a vacation. You're looking at your calendar that's completely packed and imagining how incredible it would feel to wake up one morning with absolutely nothing you have to do. And then, at least in my experience, that morning finally arrives. Nobody tells you when to wake up. Nobody expects you anywhere. Nobody cares whether you finish your work today or tomorrow. And somehow that feels heavier than expected. Not physically, mentally. Because something strange happens when all the external structure disappears. During the academic year, I don't really think about what time I should wake up. My classes decide that. I don't spend 20 minutes wondering whether I should go to the gym today or tomorrow because, well, if I don't go today, tomorrow already has something else planned. And filming YouTube videos becomes easier because I know exactly where they fit into the week. My schedule isn't necessarily comfortable, but it's solid. It already exists before I wake up. Now compare that to summer. Every morning starts with possibility, which sounds beautiful, until you realize that possibility also means decisions. Should I train first or film first? Maybe clean the house first because I'll have more energy afterward. Actually, maybe I should answer a few messages before doing anything else. Maybe breakfast should come first, maybe coffee. Maybe I should plan the day before starting the day. And then somehow I have already spent an hour without really beginning anything. Which is funny because I always thought that freedom meant having fewer decisions, but now it almost feels like the opposite. Every little choice that used to be made for me now has to be made by me, and none of those choices are particularly difficult on their own, but together they become surprisingly exhausting. I don't know if you ever had this experience, but sometimes I spend more energy trying to organize my day than actually living it. I'll open my notes app, start writing a schedule, move things around, convince myself that this version looks more balanced than the previous one, and by the time I've finally built the perfect plan, I feel like I've already done enough work for the morning, which obviously I haven't. And honestly, I think that's why I said earlier that if someone gave me an entire month with absolutely no obligations, I'd probably spend most of it trying to create a routine instead of actually following one. That answer surprised even me when I first thought about it. Because why? If freedom is supposed to make life easier, why would I immediately start rebuilding the very structure I had just escaped from? Maybe because I don't actually miss deadlines. Maybe I don't miss lectures. Maybe I don't even miss university itself. Although honestly, I kind of do. What I seem to miss is waking up inside a life that already has a shape that keeps moving whether I feel motivated or not. Because the moment that shape disappears, I become responsible for creating it from scratch every single day. And that's a much bigger job than I ever realized. And the more I think about it, the more I start wondering whether this is just something about my personality or whether people have actually lived like this for a very short period of human history. Because if that's true, then maybe I'm trying to solve a problem that didn't even exist for most of our ancestors. The thing that completely breaks my brain about this whole topic is that the busiest periods of my life are somehow the ones that feel the most alive. And I know that sounds backwards because if you ask me during exam season whether I wanted a break, I would have said yes immediately. I would have complained about assignments, about deadlines, about waking up early, about trying to fit everything into 1 week. But then those weeks end, summer arrives, life becomes easier on paper, and somehow it doesn't feel richer. It feels flatter. And I've been trying to figure out why that is. Because here's something I noticed that I had never really connected before. Where I'm extremely busy, time moves unbelievably fast. Monday morning turns into Friday evening before I even realize what happened. Sometimes I genuinely have to stop and think about what day it is because the entire week feels like one continuous movement from one thing to another. University, gym, film and editing, homework, family, friends, sleep, repeat. It's exhausting while you're inside it, but at the same time, it almost feels like life has momentum. Everything keeps pushing everything else forward. Now compare that to summer. One day can feel incredibly long. You wake up, make breakfast, check your phone, maybe answer a few messages, maybe work for a while, maybe not, and by 3 p.m., it somehow feels like you have already lived an entire day. The clock moves slowly. Everything feels stretched. So logically, and this is where it gets weird, you would expect those long summer days to become the most memorable part of the year. But for me, it's exactly the opposite. When I look back at previous summers, so many days blend together that I honestly couldn't tell you what happened on a random Tuesday in July. Everything melts into one giant memory called summer. Meanwhile, I can remember random Wednesdays during the academic year for absolutely no reason. I remember walking out of a lecture thinking about a video idea. I remember rushing from university to the gym because I only had an hour before filming. I remember sitting in a cafe editing something before class because that was literally the only free moment I had that day. Which is funny because those days disappeared so quickly while I was living them. And yet, they're the ones that stayed with me. I don't know, maybe memories don't measure time the same way clocks do. Maybe a day isn't remembered because it was long. Maybe it's remembered because something happened inside it. Actually, I think about this every September, every single year. Because during summer, I always feel like life has slowed down and then university starts again. And within a couple of weeks, I suddenly catch myself thinking, I feel like myself again. Not because university is easy, definitely not because it's relaxing, but because every day contains enough movement that even when I go to bed, I feel like I actually participated in my own life instead of watching it pass by. And honestly, I think that's the feeling I've been chasing this whole time. Not productivity for its own sake. I couldn't care less about checking boxes on a to-do list if they meant nothing. It's something much simpler than that. When I finish a day during the academic year, even if I am completely exhausted, I usually have this quiet little conversation with myself where I think, okay, today counted. I learned something, I trained, I created something. I moved one step closer to wherever I'm trying to go. That feeling is incredibly satisfying. And what's strange is that it doesn't seem to come from having more free time. It comes from feeling like every day already belongs to a larger story. Which makes me wonder whether the real problem isn't the empty calendar itself, but what our brains do the moment they encounter too much empty space. Because if that's true, then maybe my 11 hours of screen time aren't the disease at all. Maybe they're just the first symptom. I think one of the biggest mistakes I've been making is blaming the wrong thing. Because when I looked at those 11 hours of screen time, my first reaction was exactly the same reaction most people probably have. I thought, well, there's the answer. The phone is ruining my attention span. Social media is destroying my productivity. And don't get me wrong, I'm sure spending hours scrolling through short videos isn't exactly helping anyone, but honestly, the more I thought about it, the less convincing that explanation became. Because my phone didn't suddenly become more interesting in June. It was the same phone in April, the same apps, the same notifications, the same algorithm trying to keep me there. The only thing that actually changed was my life. During university, I barely touched it. I mean, there were days when my screen time was ridiculously low, and not because I had incredible self-control or because I suddenly become some kind of productivity guru. I wasn't finding my phone every 5 minutes. Most of the time, I simply forgot it existed because I had somewhere to be, something to finish, someone waiting for me, a lecture starting in 20 minutes, a workout plan for the evening, or a video that had to be filmed before sunset. There just wasn't much empty space for the phone to expand into. Now that I think about it, that's actually an interesting way to describe it. The phone expands into empty space. Not because it's evil, not because we're weak, just because empty space almost never stays empty for very long. And if you don't decide what fills it, something else will. Which honestly makes me think about something else I've noticed over the years. Some of my best ideas have never appeared while I was sitting at my desk trying to force myself to think. Never. They're almost embarrassingly predictable. They show up in the shower, while washing dishes, during a walk, sometimes halfway through a workout, sometimes while making coffee. It's almost like my brain waits until my hands are busy before it finally decides to do its best work. And I always found that strange because people say things like, you need more free time to be creative. Do you? Because I honestly don't remember many great ideas arriving after 5 hours of laying in bed watching YouTube. Actually, no, that's not true. I don't remember any. The ideas come after movement, after doing things, after conversations, after reading, after studying, after living eventually. Almost as if creativity isn't something that appears in empty space, but something that grows out of everything you've already put into your mind throughout the day. Which is funny because I used to believe that boredom automatically creates creativity. Maybe sometimes it does. But there's a difference between boredom and drifting. One gives your mind room to wander. The other quietly replaces wandering with endless consumption. And I think I've confused those two things for a long time because when I say I have free time, what I often actually have is unstructured time. Those aren't the same thing. One allows your thoughts to breathe. The other quietly hands your attention over to whatever screen happens to be closest. And then something even stranger happens. You finish watching videos, you put the phone down, you look at the clock, 3 hours disappeared. But unlike a long day at university or filming a video or learning something new, those 3 hours don't really become part of your memory. They almost evaporate the moment they are over. Which makes me wonder if that's why the emptiest periods of my life often feels the most forgettable. Not because nothing happened, but because almost nothing demanded your attention deeply enough to leave a mark. And once I started thinking about attention instead of productivity, I realized that maybe I've been looking at this whole problem from the wrong angle. Because perhaps this isn't really a story about phones or deadlines or even summer. Maybe it's something much older than all of those things. The more I started looking at this through the lens of history instead of productivity, the more I realized something that honestly seems so obvious now that I'm almost embarrassed I hadn't thought about it before. We love talking about modern problems as if they exist in isolation, as if every struggle we have somehow appeared because we personally lack discipline or motivation or self-control, but then you zoom out for a second and remember that our species has been around for hundreds of thousands of years, and suddenly one question starts bothering you. How much of this is actually new? Because if you think about the average person for almost all of human history, they didn't wake up every morning and ask themselves what kind of day they wanted to have. The day had already been decided, not necessarily by another person, sometimes by the season, sometimes by the weather, sometimes by your family, sometimes by your village, sometimes by your profession. If you were a farmer, the harvest wasn't going to wait because you didn't feel productive that morning. If you were a blacksmith, people still needed tools. If you lived in a medieval town, markets opened on specific days, churches rang bells, specific hours, festivals followed the calendar, winter arrived whether you were prepared or not, and your entire life moved together with everyone else's. Actually, that's something I find fascinating. For most of history, time wasn't something you invented. It was something you entered. You stepped into a rhythm that already existed long before you were born. And honestly, when you compare that to modern life, the difference is enormous. Today, I can wake up and decide to answer emails first, or go to the gym, or write, or edit, or clean, or postpone all of those things until tomorrow, or next week, or technically forever. That amount of freedom would have been almost unimaginable for most people throughout history, and don't get me wrong, I'm not saying life used to be better, absolutely not. I'd rather have modern medicine than medieval schedules. I'm simply wondering whether our brains fully adapted to this kind of freedom as quickly as our technology did, because evolution doesn't really care that smartphones exist. Evolution certainly doesn't care that I have a digital calendar with unlimited empty boxes waiting for me to fill them. Our environment changed unbelievably fast. Our biology probably didn't, which honestly makes this whole topic feel much less personal. Because for weeks I kept asking myself, why am I like this? Maybe that's the wrong question. Maybe a better question would be, why do so many people experience the same thing? Think about retirement. How many people spend decades dreaming about it, imagining endless free time, only to realize a year later that they feel strangely lost without work? Think about students finishing university. Think about athletes after retirement. Think about anyone whose external structure suddenly disappears. Not everyone struggles, of course. Some people adapt beautifully, but enough people do that we keep hearing the same stories over and over again. I don't know what to do with myself. I need a routine. I just need something to keep me busy. It's interesting that they almost never say they need more freedom. They already have the freedom. What they seem to miss is direction. And honestly, maybe those are completely different things, because freedom gives you possibilities. Direction tells you where to put them. And without direction, possibility can quietly turn into paralysis before you even notice it's happening. Which makes me think that maybe the thing I've been calling summer this whole time isn't really summer at all. Maybe it's simply the first period in my life where nobody else is creating the rhythm for me. And if that's true, then the thought I had a few days ago about life after university suddenly becomes much more serious than I wanted it to be. I think the moment that really unsettled me wasn't when I saw those 11 hours of screen time. Honestly, that was just a number. It was uncomfortable, sure, but numbers don't usually stay in my head for very long. The thing that stayed with me happened a few days later, and it was one of those moments where you're not even trying to analyze your life, you're just doing something completely ordinary, and then a thought appears out of nowhere that almost makes you stop walking. I suddenly realized this summer might actually be a preview of my future. And I know that sounds a little dramatic, but hear me out, because I don't mean it in a negative way. I don't mean that life after university is supposed to be empty or boring. That's not what I'm saying at all. What I realized is much simpler than that. Right now, this is the second time in my life that almost all of the structure has disappeared at once. School is over, university is on pause, music school is on pause too. Nobody is giving me assignments. Nobody's waiting for me in a classroom on Monday morning. Nobody's saying this has to be finished by Friday. But for the first time, almost everything that happens during my week depends on decisions I make myself. And honestly, that scared me much more than I expected. Which is funny, because if you had asked me a few years ago what adulthood looked like, I probably would have described exactly this: freedom, independence, choosing your own schedule, doing what you love instead of what someone else tells you to do. That's supposed to be the dream, so why did it suddenly feel fragile? I kept thinking about that for a while, and then another memory came back to me. Every single year, without exception, somewhere around the end of August, I start getting excited for September. Not because I miss exams, definitely not because I miss deadlines. I don't think anyone wakes up thinking, I really hope I get another research paper this week. It's something else. It's almost this feeling that life is about to start moving again. Actually, that's probably the best way I can describe it. Moving. Because summer, at least for me, often feels like standing in one place while trying to convince myself that I am making progress. September feels like stepping onto a moving train. The train doesn't ask whether you're motivated today. It simply goes, and somehow that makes everything easier. I know that sounds completely backwards. Because shouldn't movement require more effort than standing still? Apparently not. Sometimes standing still requires you to push yourself every single day just to begin. Movement creates its own momentum, and now that I think about it, that's probably why I have always loved busy periods of my life so much. I used to think it was because I enjoyed accomplishing things, and I do enjoy that, but I don't think that's the whole story anymore. I think I enjoy waking up knowing that today already belongs to something bigger than my mood. If I feel motivated, great. If I don't, life still continues. The lecture still starts. The workout still happens. The video still has to be filmed. Everything keeps pulling me forward. When all of that disappears, suddenly I'm the one responsible for creating the momentum every single morning. And honestly, that's a much heavier responsibility than I ever gave it credit for. So maybe the thing that frightened me wasn't the idea of graduating. Maybe it wasn't even the idea of becoming an adult. Maybe it was realizing that sooner or later, nobody's going to hand me a rhythm anymore, and whatever my life looks like after that will depend almost entirely on whether I can learn to create one myself. And I honestly don't think I'm the only person who is quietly afraid of that. I keep coming back to one question that I had at the very beginning of this video, and it's funny because I thought I was making a video about productivity, but somewhere along the way I realized I wasn't. I don't think I have been talking about productivity at all. I think I've been talking about something much more personal, and honestly I only figured that out while putting these thoughts together, because if productivity were the goal, then technically the solution would be pretty simple. Buy a planner. Download another habit tracker, wake up at 5 a.m., watch a few motivational videos. There are probably 10,000 videos on YouTube explaining exactly how to do that, and maybe some of them are genuinely helpful. But that's never been the question that bothered me. The question that bothered me was why I feel so different depending on the structure of my life. Why do I feel more alive during the busiest month of the year? Why do I go to bed happier after a day packed with responsibilities than after a completely free day? And honestly, I don't think I've found a perfect answer. I don't even know if there's one, but I do think I've stopped blaming myself as much as I used to, because for a long time I genuinely believed that every summer I somehow became a worse version of myself, less disciplined, less focused, less motivated, almost like something inside me broke every June and magically fixed itself every September. Now that sounds ridiculous. Nothing inside me changes that quickly. The calendar changes, my environment changes, the rhythm changes. And maybe that's enough to change much more than we realize. Actually, I tried a little thought experiment a few days ago. I asked myself a very simple question. If someone offered me two different lives, which one would I choose? The first one would be complete freedom. No deadlines, no obligations, no schedule, nobody expecting anything from me. I could wake up whenever I want, work whenever I want, rest whenever I want, travel whenever I want. Basically the kind of life people spend years dreaming about. The second life would be, honestly, a little chaotic. University, projects, training, YouTube, places to be, people waiting for me, deadlines that occasionally make me panic, days that end with me collapsing into bed completely exhausted. And the strange thing is, I didn't hesitate for a second. I would choose the second one. Not because I enjoy stress. I don't. Not because I enjoy pressure. Sometimes I absolutely hate it. But because every time my life becomes full like that, I feel connected to it. I feel like I'm participating instead of observing. And maybe that's the word I've been looking for this entire time, participation. Because when I look back at the periods I remember most fondly, they weren't the easiest ones. They were the ones where I felt involved, where every week seemed to lead somewhere, where I wasn't asking myself what to do next every 30 minutes because life itself kept giving me reasons to move. Maybe that's why I already miss university even though it's only summer break. Not because I miss lectures, not because I miss exams. I miss the feeling that my days naturally belong together. So I don't know, maybe the goal isn't to chase more free time after all. Maybe it's to build a life where free time doesn't quietly turn into emptiness. And honestly, I don't think I've solved that yet. If anything, this summer showed me that I still have a lot to learn about creating my own rhythm instead of borrowing one from school or university. But at least now I know what I'm actually trying to build, not a more productive life. A life that keeps moving even when nobody else is pushing forward. And somehow I think that's a much more interesting problem to spend the next few years figuring out. Anyway, that's when I found when I started asking why the freest periods of my life never felt like the happiest ones.